In this set of lecture videos, we're going to be talking about the judiciary. The judiciary refers to the court system, but in this case, we're going to be continuing our focus on the federal government, and so we'll be talking about the judiciary in the context of the federal government. But most of what I'm going to say about the federal government also applies to state governments, including California. Not everything, but the basics for how the courts work at the federal level are very similar to how the courts work at the state level as well. So after this lecture after this set of lecture videos, you'll be able to describe the structure of the federal court system. You'll be able to explain the meaning and the significance of judicial review, for a term that you're going to hear over and over again. And so the meaning and the significance are both important. You'll be able to describe the checks and balances associated with the federal courts, because remember, our system is based on checks and balances. No one branch possessing too much power. But as you'll see when we talk about judicial review, the power of judicial review is a tremendous power. And so how does the executive branch, the president, does the legislative branch, the court, the Congress, keep the courts in check? Then we'll get into something a little more complicated, but very, very important in understanding, and that is the connection between precedent and something called the doctrine of stare decisis, and I'll explain that in more detail. So again, if this sounds weird, it's because talking about the courts is always difficult, because the language that we use to talk about the courts is different. That's why in your textbook, they talk about civil rights and civil liberties in like chapter 3 or 4, and I don't talk about it until after I talk about the courts, in part because you really have to understand the courts to understand civil liberties and to understand civil rights. And so that's why the organization of my lectures and the content of my lectures is frequently different than what you'll find in the book. But at this stage, you should already know that. And then finally, you'll be able to explain the difference between a loose constructus and a strict constructionist, and we will apply that to a relevant set of court cases. It may be particularly relevant because this video is being recorded on May 20th. This first one, and probably the next ones afterwards, is being recorded on May 20th of 2022. Next month, the Supreme Court is going to issue a ruling having to do with a very famous case called Roe versus Wade that spelled out a sort of constitutionally protected a woman's right to an abortion under certain circumstances. By the time you view this, depending on which semester you're taking this in, the courts may have in fact overturned it. And so I'm not going to make a prediction. So I can't be right or wrong, but it looks like right now there's a good chance that it will be overturned. And we'll find out, but I don't know. I'm a political scientist. I am not I can't see into the future. Anyways, with that in mind, let's get started. First, let's talk about the judicial branch, the judiciary, and the basic structure on this graph I'm going to elaborate on, but it's really just 3 tiers. You've got the Supreme Court at the top. That's just one court. And in fact, that's the only court mentioned anywhere in the Constitution is the Supreme Court. Then you have the U.S. Court of Appeals, and I'll explain what they are. That's the second level down. And then the last level down, there are the U.S. district courts. There's 94 separate district courts. There's a bankruptcy court associated with each of the district courts, the Court of International Trade, U.S. Court of Federal Claims. I'm not going to talk about anything other than the district courts. So let's go through these one by one. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go through them from the bottom up. That graph shows it from the top down. I'm going to proceed from the bottom up. And the reason I'm doing that is because when a person is winds up in the federal court system, that's how they usually go. They start off at the U.S. District Court level, and then they move up, if they're able to the Court of Appeals, and then they move up to the Supreme Court if they're able to. So in the U.S. District Courts, the judges that sit on the district courts are nominated by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. In order to be confirmed by the Senate, it requires a majority vote in the United States Senate. Once somebody is nominated by a president and confirmed by the Senate to be on the in a federal district court, it is a lifetime appointment. They serve there for the duration of their life unless they either retire, they move up to a different job, or they're removed from office, because they can also be, like a president, they can be impeached and removed. Now, each state has at least one federal district court, and then some of them have multiple district courts. I'm going to show you a map a little bit later on, and you'll be able to see that visually for those of you who are able to see. The important thing to know about the district courts is that most federal cases start and end at this level, at the U.S. District Court level. What do I mean by that? The reason that a person would wind up in a federal district court would mean that they broke a federal law. If you break a state law, you go to a state court. If you break a municipal law, you would go to a municipal court. If you break a federal law, a law that applies to all of the entirety of the United States, then you're going to start your journey through the legal system at the federal district court. That's where most cases start, and that's where most cases end. So it's important to know that. So everything I talk about above the U.S. district courts, it's rare and rare that somebody gets higher in that step. Now, but there is something called the U.S. Court of Appeals. That's the next level up. Imagine somebody has been arrested for breaking a federal law, and they were found guilty at the federal district court level. They can always try to appeal their decision. And what does that mean, appeal their decision? If they feel like in some way the proper rules that the courts are supposed to follow weren't followed in their court case, they can ask for an appeal. They can ask the other courts, the Court of Appeals, to look over what happened in the court case. I'm sorry for that weird little jump, but it was bothering me that these things were on separate pages. So let me get back to where we were. There we go. Whoa, wrong. Okay, so if in a court case at the federal district level, if somebody believes that their rights were violated in some way, they can go to the Court of Appeals and they can say, hey, I feel like something was not done properly, and I want you to look over what happened. My point is that in the U.S. Court of Appeals, what they don't do is they don't retry the cases. Like, you got arrested for something, you were charged with a crime at the federal district level, you were found guilty, let's say, you go to appeal the decision. It's not like the judges are going to listen to the entire case and make a decision again. That's not how it works. What they're going to do is not retry the case, listen to everything all over again and come to it, see what decision they come to. You don't get a do-over per se at the U.S. Court of Appeals. What they'll do is they'll examine the process, not the facts in the case. And if they feel like the rules weren't followed, right, then they may very well say to the district courts, hey, by the way, this rule wasn't followed, right? And that may be why this person was found guilty. You need to do this case over again and don't break that rule, right? And so they'll basically send the case back to the U.S. District Court and say, you guys need to do this again but follow the rules. By the way, it isn't just the person who's found guilty who can appeal. Let's say the government arrests somebody for violating a federal law, and this person is found innocent. Well, the government can also file an appeal. They can also go to the district court and say, hey, we think the lower court, the district court, broke some rules, and this guy should have been found guilty. We want you to look over the process and what happened. So maybe, for example, in the lower courts, the federal government wanted to present some evidence, and the lower court said you can't present that evidence for whatever reason. It doesn't matter. The lower court said you're not allowed to present that. You know, if the government feels like we should have been allowed to present that, that wasn't cool, that's why this guy was found innocent, then they can appeal as well. So it's not just the person who's found guilty. If the government feels that the rules weren't followed, they can appeal as well. In either case, the thing to know about the decisions in the U.S. Court of Appeals is those are almost always final. Like the U.S. district courts, when they make a decision, it's usually final, vast majority of the time. But if somebody's fortunate enough to make it to the U.S. Court of Appeals and their appeal is actually listened to, that decision is going to be definitely going to be final. The court is going to, especially if the court says no, everything was done properly, you know, the rules were all followed. The likelihood that you're going to be able to go above the U.S. Court of Appeals to the Supreme Court, which is the next step, it's very, very slim, right? So just know that that's the case. But if they send the case back to the district court will do the trial all over again, and the process starts all over again. Now, one other thing, there's a map here of the federal court system. For those of you who can see it, it's a map of the United States divided up by what are called circuits. Again, for those of you who can see it, you can see that each of the states are sort of grouped together with a slightly different color. And then there's a dark number over each sort of grouping of states. So for example, if you look where we live in the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit includes the states that are kind of that yellowish color: Montana, Washington, Idaho, Oregon, Nevada, California, Arizona, Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands. If you break a federal law, you're going to go to a district court in one of those states. And then in every circuit, so we're on the Ninth Circuit, there is one court of appeals. And so if you are found guilty and you try to get your case appealed to the Court of Appeals, every one of these circuits has a Court of Appeals, and that's where the case is heard. So it's not like if you live in Montana, there's a Court of Appeals there. In Idaho, there's a Court of Appeals there. I believe it's in San Francisco. I should know this, but I don't, and I'm not going to pretend that I do. And one of the other things that you can see, if you can see this map, is that Washington, if you look, there's a little line dividing sort of eastern and western Washington. There are two district courts in Washington. There's only one in Montana, one in Idaho, one in Oregon, one in Nevada, one in Arizona, one in Alaska, everywhere else. But if you look at California, there are 4 different district courts in California. So it's every state has at least one district court. Some of them have more than one. It's not based entirely on population. I'm not sure how they came up with this grouping of, it's not how they came up with this grouping, because Washington isn't a particularly populous state, but it's got 2, right? It's not based on the size of the state, because Alaska is actually huge. You wouldn't know from this kind of map, but Alaska is huge, but they only have 1. So I don't understand why it's broken down the way it is. And I'm not going to pretend I do. So there you go. That's the structure. Now in the next video, I'm going to talk about the Supreme Court. So we went from the district court to the Court of Appeals. Now we're going to go to the Supreme Court in the next lecture video.